Big picture. Let's start with big picture. Everyone kind of internalizes stuff individually, especially when you're subject to discrimination. You focus on your own situation and your best way of managing that. But if you step back to the big picture, there's something wider going on. So, for example, the Birmingham City Council case, 200 women sued Birmingham City Council for equal pay. They were cooks, cleaners, carers, yeah? How much were they awarded at the end of their case? Any idea? 1,200 million. 1.2 billion pounds was owed to 200 lower paid women working for Birmingham City Council. That was the true nature of their equal pay debt. Now we all know women are paid 18%, or maybe they say 13% less than men these days, yeah? On paper, Birmingham City Council had a positive gender pay reporting. So on paper, women were paid more than men at Birmingham City Council. But the true debt to the women is 1,200 million. The true debt to all women workers in the country as we stop the clock now is £1 trillion. Okay? Putting that in a bigger picture, we live in an economy which is a 4 trillion a year economy. The total government spending is about 1.1 trillion a year. So women are owed the entire government budget as a lawful debt. So what happened after Birmingham City Council had to pay out that sum of money, 1,200 million? They had to sell all their property. They had to sell the National Exhibition Centre, and then they had to borrow 300 million from the government to avoid bankruptcy. We know women are paid somewhere between 13 and 18% less than men. How much are black people paid less than white people? About 26%. It's anything from 26 to 39%. There's very little research on it. Remember when Theresa May came in, who seemed like a bit of a white liberal conservative, although she embarked on the hostile environment against the Windrush generation in 2012. Yeah? She said women are not being paid equally, so we need to do something about that. Black people suffer within the criminal justice system, so we need to do something about that. Now, on paper, that sounds quite good, doesn't it? But then it consigns by a racist stereotype black people existing only and only needing support within the criminal justice system. It ignored the 26% underpay. Flip it again. If black people are owed £300 billion in equal pay as of today, and women are owed 1.2 trillion, so it's 1.5 trillion, what does that mean for businesses? Businesses have made 1.5 trillion pounds of profit based on not paying black people and not paying women what they're owed. That's the bigger game. It's all about cheap labour. So if you go back in history, 1950s, after the Second World War, we needed a cheap labour force, didn't we? So we advertised to the colonies and ex-colonies, and you had what's called now the Windrush generation. For cheap labour. That's the height of it. To run our services so we could pay them at least 26% less than white people. That's what it was all about. And the community grew. 100,000 black people in Notting Hill. What happened in Notting Hill in 1958? There were riots. The Teddy Boys declared war on black people. They beat up black people. Yeah? What happened as a result of the 1958 riots? We introduced, first time in 1965, Race Relations Act. What did that do? That said you weren't allowed to be racist in social spaces. No longer could you refuse to serve a black person because they're black. No longer could you deliberately overcharge them because they're black. No longer could you deliberately delay the provision of a service to a black person because they're black. But even then, they didn't protect you in work. So you could go to work, you'd still be abused, there's nothing you could do about it. So 1968, they introduced protection in work. But only in this way, that the employer can no longer refuse to employ you because you're black. They could sack you because you're black. They could treat you like shit because you're black at work. They could harass you. But the whole of our society didn't see anything wrong with that. Get to 1976 and finally you have protection against racism in work, against harassment, against dismissal. So we've only had that since 76. What did they do though in terms of the rights? They gave you the plausibility, they gave you cosmetic rights. Okay, I'll give you an example. If you buy a television, how long do you have to sue for if your television proves to be defective? 6 years. 6 years for any breach of contract. If I shout and scream at you so you have a nervous breakdown at work or in society, how long do you have to sue? 3 years. If I shout and scream at you and cause you to have a nervous breakdown, and in shouting and screaming at you, I call you lots of racist names, how long do you have to sue? You'd think 3 years, wouldn't you? It's 3 months less a day. So they're making it very difficult for people to claim. The official reason given in Parliament for why you should only have 3 months to sue for racial harassment is you may have forgotten about it in the interview. You don't forget your TV's defective over 6 years, but a black person's going to forget being racially harassed more than 3 months ago. Yeah? Second thing they did is they put a cap on compensation, so your compensation was limited to £11,000. It was completely illegal. They made it very difficult to prove. So even now, only 4% of people win their race claims when they bring them, statistically, nationally. They're very expensive to run. The awards are very low. The average award for racism before dismissal is how much currently? It's £12,000. So unless you've been dismissed, you're looking at an average award of £12,000. I represented a black guy who was pinned to a wall by an Asian guy in this case and called the N-word. How much did the tribunal award him for that? It was done in front of all the other workers. £2,500. £2,500. So that's the system. So now, I mean, where these talks started from was about silent suffering. If you're discriminating, so let's start with the bigger picture again. 25% of people in this country for the last 50 years have admitted to being very or a little racist. They've admitted it in the British standard of surveys of attitudes, yeah? That's remained quite consistent. It's got worse recently, but it's always been 25%. So you have statistically a 1 in 4 chance when you go into a workplace of encountering a racist. Now that racist may express their dislike for you openly, probably not, because there's still a risk of being dismissed in some places, or indirectly, is what people say, unconsciously, in a way that you can't prove it. They know what they're doing when they offer you a bunch of bananas if you make a complaint, as happened to a lady recently in the last year when she complained to a supermarket about being followed around by security. The manager said, "I'm really sorry, they were just doing their job, would you like a bunch of bananas?" And then smirked. Yeah? So, in truth, 30% of black workers will face racial harassment in the workplace. It's a stat, it hasn't changed. It's the same here, by the way, as it is in the States. It's exactly the same stat. Only 1% of the people who face racism in work formally complain about it. They're too scared to. They're isolated. They suffer in silence. If you push back, what happens if you do complain? Normally, you're retaliated against. So then what can you do? You can bring what's called a grievance. 99% of all grievances for race discrimination fail. They're rejected. Why is that? Partly it's because the company's protecting itself, partly because they usually stand behind the more senior person who's often in a position of power who's being discriminating against you. But mostly it's because if they upheld your grievance, you could sue them, and they couldn't defend it. So the internal logic of a grievance process is you always lose. And although 99% of people lose, most win on the same facts of the tribunal. Although remember, only 4% win on average because most people can't access lawyers because they can't afford lawyers. So you have on paper the right to sue for race discrimination, but when it happens to you in the workplace, you're isolated, even sometimes from your allies in the work, because they're scared too, and you have no power. So self-reflection is really important, and that's a way of growing. But it's for structural stuff. So I've been doing this now for 20 years. We've brought in £50 million worth of compensation. We've got 4 of the highest discrimination awards in history. We've even beat the United States of America on the sexual harassment case. But I can tell you that the position on the ground in the workplace today is worse than it was 15 years ago. So despite working all those hours over all those years, it's worse now than it was. And it's going to get worse, because this is not happening by chance. It's because people are trying to run an ideology which effectively protects wealth and allows a flow of wealth from a rich group away from a working class group. A working class is us. Anyone who has to work for a living is working class. Anyone who's in a fortunate position of not having to work for a living and have 10 million in assets is a rich. These are the only two groups in society. There's no middle class, there's no working class, it's just working class, everybody, 98%, 2% rich. And the 2% rich since COVID have got incredibly wealthy. And we've all become incredibly poor. Relatively so. Now, Reform are at 4 million. They want to get to 10 million by the next election. Why is 10 million quite an important number for them? Labour Party only got 9 million votes to get a landslide. That's why the Conservatives are reaching out to them, because Reform's growing. They have a mission. Now, Reform's mission, if you look at their manifesto, is to abolish the Equality Act. Yeah? If Reform gets into power, you will no longer have a right not to be discriminated on the basis of race in the workplace. You can be sacked because of your colour. You can be called the N-word in the workplace, and there won't be a thing you can do about it. We'll be transported back to the early 70s. And you think, well, that's never going to happen, but it's on the table. And you say, you look at Donald Trump and you look at DEI, and he's saying we're going to roll back on that, and everyone's going, oh, that's really bad. Well, is it? This trust said that in December 20. We're 4 years ahead. The hostile environment was to make black people uncomfortable in this country. That came in 2012. Brexit was based on anti-foreigner sentiment. Everything stoked up. Racial harassment doubled between 2016 and now in the workplace. What we can do is we can come together as we do today and then act on that. Because in the workplace, it's still almost impossible to say no. Yeah? Because of retaliation. We have to make it more possible to say no. There's two ways we can do that. One is we let those people know that we are there by way of support. And the other is giving them legally enforceable rights. Because if they had the right, as they do, say, in the United States, to punitive damages, that guy pinned against the wall would have got £10 million, for sure. Do you think that company would have sacked that manager? Absolutely, because it's just economics. If you're paying out 12,000 and you're a multi-billion corporation, you don't care. If you're paying out 10 million, it begins to affect you. So punitive damages, litigation funds, so you don't have to fund your own lawyer, an equal employment commission, which is going to take the case even for you, run it for you, as they do in the States, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. Not the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That has become politicised and weaponised. Liz Truss said in December 2020, I'm appointing a new chair to the Equality and Human Rights Commission and 4 new commissioners to carry out what? The government's agenda. Staff there were forbidden from making any findings of institutional racism from that point onwards, from 2020, even if they had evidence of it. They went and looked into the Metropolitan Police, and 2 or 3 years of the data that Baroness Casey looked at, they looked as well. They saw nothing. No institutional racism. Yeah? So that body's dead now. So then what do we have? We have nothing really out there that deals with community safety. I mean, the stuff that deals with community safety is like Stand Up to Racism and other organisations do a great job. But that's all about protecting black people in the criminal sphere from criminal attack. But most people experience racism at work. Most people have that drip, drip, drip. Yeah? The one that eats away at your mental health. You have to sort of still your mind in wanting to go into work. That's the stuff that eats into people. And that's where the money is. That's where the power is. Because they still want black people to be paid 26% less than white. They want black people to disproportionately be in insecure employment in the low wage economy. Because if they're there, they can make more profit. And that's what this is about. Reform, and Farage in particular, doesn't give a damn about racism. I don't think Trump does either. Yeah? They're both probably racist, but they don't care about that. They care about making more money. And the people who fund reform want a lower wage economy where you don't have any rights, so you can be paid less, so they can make more money. And as we came out of Europe, why did we go into Europe? Any idea? To make more money. It was because our markets aligned more with Europe. We were moving away from the States. It made economic sense. Why did we leave Europe? To make more money. The rich realized that they had to begin to align themselves more with China and away from Europe because they make more money. And does China have a good human rights record? So China going to object if we abolish the Equality Act? They'll probably support it. Yeah? That's where it's going. So the proposal is we set up a new movement, and it's called the No Movement. It's the ability to say no. At the moment, we only have 1% of people in the workplace who say no, and they're scared and traumatized and doing their best to survive. If we get to a point where 80 or 90% can say no, we can change the whole agenda. And if you can secure your income, and you can get promotion, and you can use your talents and make money, then you have power. You take that power back. But it's not an individual thing. You can't do it individually. No matter how brave Andy is, for example, fighting for both himself and his members, he needs help from the outside. Yeah? And that's what the No Movement, we hope, will be able to achieve. So we're going to try and launch that next month. And it's going to be a way, because you have strength in numbers. If we can get the No Movement to 5 million in 5 years, we can affect structural change. Because it's the structure, it's about moving that super tanker and turning it around in the opposite direction so the flow of wealth comes back to us rather than away from us. It can be done with weight of numbers in a democracy. Reform certainly believe it. So why don't we? We have more reason to be allied and to fight together than they do. They're just based on what? Hatred of foreigners? Is that a binding thing for our society? Isn't compassion and care for your family a stronger one? So let's do it. That's the proposal.